MKE600 is a shotgun microphone ideal for professional video camera applications. Maximal rejection of ambient side noises thanks to pronounced directivity. And because the MKE600 has a very good suppression of structure-borne noise, it makes one of the most versatile all-round shotgun microphones on the market.
The new Super 35 sensor that Canon have introduced with the C300 Mark III is quite a big step up from other S35 sensors that they have created before. From the body and the flexibility that gives us in terms of the expansion packs and the interchangeable mount, to the sensor with its increased dynamic range for tackling scenes that possibly we couldn't have tackled or captured faithfully before, I can get more out of this camera. My money goes further. It's as simple as that from a business standpoint. From a creative point of view, it's unquestionably unlocking more creative avenues for us as filmmakers.
Sorry, everyone. We've just started. Our mics were muted, but our picture went live for some reason. I don't know quite how that happened. I think I may have pressed the wrong button. Guess who's learning? Oh, you still couldn't hear me, could you? I still didn't press the right button. Now I've pressed the right button. Welcome, everyone, to the most professional stream on the internet about pro video gear. Let me know if you can actually hear me now. Thumbs up. Fantastic. Sorry about the wonky start. I think I I am very much looking forward to the time when I can have someone operate these streams and not have to do it and host at the same time. Oh dear. Right. So let's pretend that wonky start didn't happen. I tell you what, I can start by pressing the logo. There we go. Let's just cut to the logo.
But Carl, don't worry about it.
I don't think that saved it, has it?
I got about 15 minutes into one of my own live streams and there's messages popping up saying, we can't actually hear you.
Can't hear you. It's so easy to do. So easy to do. But anyway, we're in now. Welcome, everyone. This is our stream on the FS7, a camera that probably needs no introduction, really, does it? And just like the camera needs no introduction, I'm joined by Alister, who I'm sure you all know very well by now as well. How are you, Alister?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm raring to go to talk about what is a wonderful workhorse camera, the FS7 and obviously the FS7 II.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been talking about these cameras now for how long? Because, I mean, the FS7 II, we'll talk about the differences maybe a little bit, but it's essentially, in terms of a general picture, the same camera. It fits in exactly the same slot as the Mark I did. So when was the Mark I released?
Yeah, it must be 6 years now.
Yeah,
I'm trying to think,
it must be.
So probably just coming up for 6 years. So would have been IBC September, probably 6 years September.
Yeah,
so
I think that sounds about right. Alistair's volume's very low. Thank you very much, then, man. I can correct that. Yeah, so we've been talking about this camera for a long time, but it is still the FS7 II is still the most popular camera in the industry, really. I mean, sure, we've had new cameras like the FX9 and the new CF300 and all that sort of stuff that have started to massively pick up interest. But the FX9, I think, the FS7 II still holds the top slot, both in terms of sales and in terms of rentals and all the rest of it. It's just such an industry workhorse. It really, really is. So let's get this. One
of Sony's competitors, they call the FS7 the Sony Rat because this is a company that has a lot of people work in London, and in London it's rumoured that you're never more than a metre from a rat. Yeah. So they call the FS7 the Sony Rat because they reckon that wherever you go in the world, you're never more than a metre from an FS7.
There's no sets out there without one, yeah.
Every rental house, every production company practically has had one or used one, or they are ubiquitous. They are everywhere.
Absolutely. And there's good reasons for that. I'm sure we'll go into a lot of them, and I'm sure a lot of the people watching have used them or had experiences. Let us know. In fact, Tyler's just done that. He loves the FS7, been preparing to shoot a project with the FS7 RAW with the Odyssey recorder. The image is insanely clean and dynamic. Yep, absolutely, Tyler. Yeah. Let us know, everyone who's watching, what experience you've got with the FS7. Is it something that you haven't used yet? Or is it something that you've used day in, day out? And if you've got any questions. But this is essentially just it's not going to be a simple product overview. We all know what the camera is. But I wanted to get you on, Alister, to talk about what the camera is now in 2020. Where does it sit in 2020? Is it just going to hang around until other cameras like the FX9 replace it, or does it still very much have a place in the lineup? So I guess that's a great direct question to start with, is do you think the FX9 particularly replaces the FS7 Mark II, or do you think they both coexist alongside each other?
I think they genuinely and absolutely both coexist alongside each other. Sure. I mean, if we look back historically, whenever a manufacturer has brought out a replacement camera, when we talk of an actual replacement, assuming that the replacement is well accepted, it still takes anywhere up to 2, maybe even 3 years sometimes for that replacement to become the de facto camera and the previous model to no longer be used. It just takes time because people have developed their workflows. They know how to handle the footage. They know what works, what doesn't. They know how to get the best from it. So if the FX9 was a replacement for the FS7, well, yes, the FX9 will grow in popularity. It would still be a couple of years before it replaced an FS7.
Sure.
But the FX9 isn't an FS7 replacement. The FX9 is a more expensive camera. It does things slightly differently to the FS7. The FX9 is very, very much a 4K and UHD camera. And what I'm saying there is actually, as an HD camera, it has some limitations that the FS7 doesn't have, with lookup tables and things like that. So the FX9 is a step up. It's a very, very slightly different audience. The FS7 is still incredible value for money. They are everywhere in every rental house, and everybody knows how to use them, understands them, know what it's going to deliver. And they're just not going to go away anytime soon because of that. I think if you were looking to purchase a new camera, it is a tough decision. Would you choose FX9 or FS7 or FS7 II? FS7 I is no longer available. And it would be a tough decision to make. But there are still things that the FS7 does that maybe for somebody that's looking for that general purpose run and gun camera, it still excels at. So one of the big things with the FX9 is because it has this bigger sensor and a lot of other features that are coming on that require more processing power, it uses more electricity, more energy. So your batteries only last half as long, if that sometimes. So you've got to take twice as many batteries. You've got to be much more organized with battery charging and all of those sorts of things. Whereas the FS7 sips power compared to the FX9.
It's a really low power draw. I think it's about 19 watt hour, 19 watts an hour draw.
Yeah, a couple of BPU 60s is all most people need for a whole day's shooting.
Yeah.
Whereas an FX9, you need 4 or 5, if not more. And then when you've got that many batteries, you run into, how the hell do I charge that many batteries overnight? You've either got to have 5 chargers, because most of the chargers only do a single battery, or a couple of dual chargers, or you set your alarm to get up in the middle of the night to swap them over. So there are things there. I've done that. Let's not go there. But so there are things to consider, and the FS7 is still that little bit smaller. Accessories and things like that for it are cheaper. It's just generally still a lower cost option that for most end viewers, most of the time, if you know what to do with an FS7, it produces a great picture. And is the audience, if you were to swap tomorrow to an FX9, are your audience, and you've got to be brutally honest with yourself, actually going to notice? And in most cases, I don't think they would notice. Is there a difference? Yes, I believe the FX9 does produce a better picture. But at the same time, I'm not sure the audience would either notice or care, more importantly.
Yeah, we have definitely reached the point in camera technology where most recent cameras, the leaps and that we see in image quality with new models that come out are not so much leaps anymore, they're steps. And so, yes, the FX9 is better in almost every single way than the FS7 was in terms of image quality. You know, it's got better low light, it's got better dynamic range, it's got better color science, it's got better all the rest of it. But does that mean that the FS7 is, I'm going to do this all the way through the stream, by the way, call it the FX7. The FS7, does it mean that that's not a good in each one of those areas? Absolutely not. No. It's a great camera.
Well, I mean, I think if we, in terms of cameras, and it was what we touched on earlier, is Sony have sold more FS7s in the time that's been in the market than if you put all, now, I mean, those of you that go back, as far as I do in television, Betacam was for decades. How many years actually? Betacam SP. So I started shooting on Betacam SP. Must have been about oh God, 1989, 1990, and probably stopped shooting, I suppose it was a decade. I guess you're looking at about maybe 10 to 15 years where it was the industry standard for broadcast television. And they made lots of different models of Betacam cameras, BBW 300s, 400s, etc. If you put all of those together, Sony have made more sold more FS7s than they have all of those cameras put together, all those different models, which shows you how successful it is. And I think that tells a very clear story that actually the camera, they got it right. And while it was never the best at anything, the balance of what it offered for the price was superb. And that hasn't changed. And it's a 4K camera, and we're in a 4K world still. There's still an awful lot of HD production goes on as well. So it's the world that the FS7 exists in terms of what you need to supply and deliver, hasn't actually changed since the day it was launched. The requirements of what you need to deliver are largely the same. So it's still capable of ticking all those very same boxes and delivering everything that it was always designed to do today. It's not like we're suddenly in a world where you have to deliver in 8K or have to deliver everything at 120 frames per second. We're not. The world hasn't changed yet. So there's still, the FS7 probably has another 5 or 6 years in it, actually, before it actually becomes what you might start thinking about as obsolete. But even then, it'll still be used beyond then, I'm quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, the in terms of sales numbers, you know, the FS7 absolutely echoes that. We have sold, I think, more. I suppose you've got to join the FS7 I and FS7 II together, and if you do that, I think it's probably, maybe the Blackmagic Pocket 4K has come close in terms of numbers, but it's those two numbers, and that's impressive because the FS7 has been a £8,000 camera, you know, whereas the little Blackmagic is small change compared to that, and so for a camera at that price point to sell in those numbers, they must have got so many things right with that camera. So let's go through a little bit as to what they really did get right. What do you think has had the biggest impact on why it became so incredibly popular?
Well, I think it was one of the first Super 35 cameras that was actually usable in an ENG or a run and gun role. So there are many other cameras that offer Super 35 around. I mean, you've got Canon's offerings, Red, etc., Blackmagic. Yep. But I think one of the things that it offered was something that was easy to use. The hand grip, where you could control the camera from that hand grip with the zoom rocker and everything else. If you have the Sony power zoom lenses on there, it just made a good package. And I think this is the thing about the FS7. It's not just the camera body. If you've got the 18 to 110 millimeter power zoom on there, it's very much an ENG style camera. And works very much like a traditional shoulder-mounted news camera of the past would. So you were able to go out and shoot news, to shoot very quickly, very fluidly with it, without any major dramas. I mean, large sensor cameras, zoom range and things like that are always a bit of a compromise, and that's just the nature of that beast. But the FS7 kind of made that easier, and it was less of a hindrance than I think with a lot of other cameras. I mean, even if you compare it to Sony's F5 and 55, which are broadly the same camera, same vintage and everything else, from a run and gun news gathering type perspective, the FS7 is probably the better camera, even though technically the F55 is produces perhaps a bit better picture because of the way the lenses work, because you had that zoom lens with the rocker that behaved easily, quickly, simply. And it was a camera that also at the same time, though, offered Cine EI for shooting or film style production and things like that. So it was really very, very versatile. And I think it really democratized that whole filmmaking with log process. Other camera manufacturers had cameras that did it, but
I mean,
gave you 14 stops of log.
Just rewind and think about what the camera landscape was like when it was announced. So within Sony's own lineup, you had the F5 and the F55, which hadn't been long released, which you mentioned, which were higher end, and then you had the FS100 and FS700, which this sort of came along and replaced effectively. And then outside of that world. You had this Canon C300, which was very popular at the time. And that was really it in terms of its main competition there, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so I think democratizing it is absolutely the right way to put it, because it essentially took what Sony were doing at the F55 and the F5 level and brought it down to the C300s level, which was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a big deal. And the way the log works, the way the whole, everything works, you could use it to shoot something for Netflix. It's approved for Netflix. Or you could just go out and shoot your news story in HD using the zoom lens like an ENG camera. And it was this one camera that did both. Does both really well, and you don't have to have two cameras. And I think perhaps what caught Sony by surprise, and I think maybe a lot of people by surprise, was how widely it was picked up by news organizations, not as an extra camera to go off and do the special features, but actually as the mainstream run-of-the-mill news camera, because the interviews, when you sat down and did your interviews, they looked great because of the shallow depth of field, and then you're back out in the street covering the action, and the zoom lens made it easy to use. So it just was straightforward, ticked a lot of boxes. And even when the FS5 came along, which I think a lot of FS7 owners at the time were really concerned about, it's like, oh my word, they've just released this camera, it's got the same sensor, it's smaller, it's lighter, it uses even less power. They were worried that it was going to steal the FS7's thunder, and it didn't. It complemented the FS7 really well, but it didn't have the broadcast codecs that the FS7 has, and the lookup tables and all the other things that make the FS7 the well-rounded package that it is.
So if we fast forward now to present day, that camera landscape, you just mentioned it, in Sony's lineup is obviously much more crowded because the FS5 Mark II is a very capable camera, and then they've got the FX9 sitting just above it. And of course the F5 and F55 are still around. But then on the wider outside of that brand, you've got Ursa Mini Pro, you've got Canon's got a much more wider lineup now with the C300s, C500s, C200s, etc. It's the EVA 1. There's lots more cameras going on in this same level of the industry. And yet the FS7 II is still outselling them all. And it's still being chosen by the majority of productions, and it's still the most rented camera on the market. So how about why? A lot of that is because it's so widely known, because of all the reasons we've just been talking about, because it got big because of those. But it is still a very sensible choice for people. So what do you think is the main reason why it's still used now? Because I think variable ND might be one of them.
Well, the variable ND filter is one of the greatest things that Sony have ever put in a camera in recent years. It really it makes shooting, run and gun ENG really easy. And until early this year, I had an F5, and I loved shooting with that camera from a image quality point of view, and sort of the ergonomic styling for the film style shoots that I was doing worked really well. Yep. But every time I used the F5, I was always like, oh God, where's the variable ND filter? I really want it, because you've got 2 stops or even 3 stop steps between each of the filters in the camera, and you could never get the aperture that the actual aperture you wanted. It was always halfway between the 2 ND filters. And the variable ND filter just allows you to, it changes the way you fundamentally shoot. Once you've used a camera with the variable ND filter, you don't actually change the iris very often. You do it all with the ND instead. I'm using an FX9 right now to shoot this, and I use the aperture to set my depth of field, and then the ND filter to set the exposure. So you just change the way you work, because you can choose your depth of field much more freely, and then set the exposure of the variable ND. And it was also that whole thing of being able to use lenses from third parties on the Sony camera, and get around any possible issues with aperture and things like that by using the ND filter, the variable ND instead. And it is a great thing. Is it the reason why the FS7 II has been so incredibly popular? it's one of many. I think the reason why the FS7 and the FS7 II are still going strong is because they're tried, trusted, and proven. And they've had their issues. These cameras, they're never perfect. They're built to a price. The viewfinder mount isn't everyone's cup of tea. There's plenty of third-party options now, fortunately, but it's not a perfect camera, but people know it and they trust it. It's reliable. Issues are very rare. Problems few and far between, to be honest. So I think that's just given it this reputation of being just a workhorse. What you want, especially in television news, or if you're a small production company, whatever. I mean, obviously image quality is important. Obviously all of those things matter, but what you want more than anything else is to know that when you get the camera out of the cupboard and you turn it on, it's going to work. And that you can give it to your camera operator and he's not going to be scratching his head going, how does this camera work? So because there's so many FS7s out there, most people have come across them at some point. Most people have used them. So most people know how to get a picture out of one. So if you've got to bring in a freelancer for a day because your normal cameraman's off sick, anything like that, FS7 is just brilliant because you're not going to have a problem finding somebody that knows how to use it, or if you need to bring in a second camera. There's a million camera operators out there with them to choose from. So you just bring in another camera operator with another FS7, they're going to match. There's no dramas. And that's not going to go away for a very, very long time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The only thing that will make that change for it is if cameras come along that work in a very similar way. And I don't think the FX9 does because of its full frame sensor. So it would have to be an FS7 Mark III or whatever that direct replacement is for that to really change for the camera.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think there is a room for an FS7 Mark III. So what I would do if I was Mr. Sony is I would perhaps take the sensor from the FX9, put it in a FS7 body, but have it only operate at Super 35. That way you got to have a difference between it and the FX9. But then sort of bring back some of the bit more of the HD thing. So one of the things with the FX9 is that if you are in HD, you can't have lookup tables separate to your recording. You have lookup tables, or you can't have lookup tables. So you can't record in log and have a lookup table, whereas you can with the FS7. So I think there's space there for maybe an FS7 type camera, a little bit cheaper, Super 35 only, but perhaps with some of the newer color science that you can turn on and off. And the default would be the FS7 look, so that you turn it on and it looks like an FS7, so you can match it with other FS7s. But then when you want to do something with FX9s, you can go to the S Cinetone and turn that on if you want. So I think there is actually room for an FS7 III to take the best bits of some of the nicer bits of the FX9, match that with some of the things that the FS7 does quite nicely, and have a cheaper option there that's maybe just Super 35 only. I don't know.
I think the Super 35 bit is the key, isn't it? I mean, once you take the step up to a full frame sensor or a large format sensor, you've then got, it's really the lenses become a big problem, but also processing power. I mean, you mentioned the power consumption of the FX9 and also the limitations in 1080p. I imagine a lot of those, do you think, are actually driven by the full extra processing power that a larger format sensor needs?
Yeah, a lot of it is. I mean, you're pulling twice as much information off that sensor in each scan, so you're having to deal with twice as much data all of the time if you're using the full frame scan. Now we do have to remember, of course, you can use an FX9 in Super 35 mode, and then you could just stick with Super 35 lenses, and there's no reason why you have to use full frame. But once you have a full frame camera, it does tend to change the way you think about lenses and change your preferences. So you're going to want to buy and to own full frame lenses, and especially with zooms, that becomes even more challenging than Super 35. If your camera only has Super 35, then you're not even going to be looking at those necessarily. There's more lenses to choose from, because don't forget the bulk of your cinema lenses are Super 35, because full frame is a photo thing, really. It's not a digital cinematography thing. So I think there is room for another Super 35 FS7 type camera in the market. Or there is, or do you just perhaps try and add S-Cinetone to the FS7 II? The sensors are obviously different, but I think you could go a long way towards getting that S-Cinetone look out of an FS7 if you could, get in there and do your own gamma curves, or if Sony really wanted to do it. I mean, like the FS5 Mark II has that Venice look profile, which is somewhat similar to S-Cinetone. So I'm quite sure it could be done if Sony wanted to. And I think actually a lot of FS7 and FS7 II owners, maybe we should put that to Sony, wouldn't mind paying for that as an upgrade, as a firmware upgrade, to have an FS7 Mark III with that newer firmware with something like S-Cinetone in there, and maybe if you charged, I don't know, pulling a number out of thin air, let's say on the high side, £1,000. I'd be interested to hear actually from people who are watching whether that's something they think would be good. So rather than having to buy a new camera and everything else, let's say £1,000 or less than £1,000, you could have S-Cinetone and all that in your existing camera. I think a lot of people would go for that. I really do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of all the things that people complain about with the FS7 II, and you mentioned some of them like the viewfinder mount and all the rest of it, I think the only one that I ever hear in terms of image quality is color. It's color accuracy, skin tones, things like that. And S-Cinetone has not fixed a lot of them, but it has improved that. I hear a lot less people talking about that with the FX9, and part of that's a new sensor, but I do think a lot of it is S-Cinetone as well.
Yeah, but there's something really interesting that's going on there right now with that. So you see it all the time on the forums and the user groups right now, is people that are really struggling to try and match an FX9 or other cameras to an FX9. It's like, oh God, how do I make my FS7 and the FX9 match? And they're really struggling with it because it isn't easy. And this is the problem and I think Sony were aware of this. This is why for so many years, Sony cameras have always looked the same, or broadly speaking the same. I believe, and I hope I'm not going to get told off for this, that Sony had a color reference that they called Phoenix. And all of their cameras were referenced to this color reference for decades, I think it was called Phoenix. And the idea was that no matter what Sony camera you brought, it would look the same. So you could have all your studio cameras doing a studio piece, and then you cut to a news camera out in the field, and it looks the same. It doesn't look different. And this goes back to the days of Betacam. And so the Betacam cameras had a certain look, and the cameras that came along that replaced Betacam, like digital Betacam, they looked the same because a lot of productions mixed digital Betacam and Betacam. And then we went to HD cam and everything, and everything's always looked the same so that they were easier to match. And that created a problem for Sony once we got to say 10 years ago, when there was this big shift in the industry from television cameras to more film style production, and large sensors and all of that sort of stuff started to appear. And there was a big move then to move away from this traditional, what I would call a daytime TV look, to a much more film style look. But of course, every single Sony camera has this daytime TV look. Now along comes the FX9 and Venice, and everyone's tearing their hair out trying to make the new generations of cameras match the old ones. Well, of course they won't. And this was always going to be the problem for Sony, was that the day they decided to move away from that old reference to this new world reference, there was going to be a gap. And that's really difficult to deal with. So
yeah, my
assumption is that going forwards, that most of Sony's cameras will have S-Cinetone in them, and this will become the new standard. And all the previous generations will still comply with the old standard. But that was always going to be a problem, and that's why it took so long, I believe, for Sony to make that switch, because they knew it would be challenging.
Well, if S-Cinetone becomes the new standard, I'm perfectly fine with that. I think it's a lovely look. It's what's the FX9 that's filming me right now is set to, for example. Okay, so a bit of feedback on the firmware update thing. Levi says it makes sense, which is great. Fenderman says add HLG and S-Cine tone to my FS7 II. Might pay for it, but $1,000 is too much.
Okay, that's good. Good to
Fair
know.
enough.
I mean, it's I don't know. It's pure speculation. But I talk to the guys from Sony very often, so it's something I can mention. As we did a webinar, and people thought it was a nice idea, but maybe $1,000 was too much. So it's good to know.
Now, an interesting point from Thenderman on the FS7 Mark III, if you like. What would we put into a new update of it? He says a new sensor, higher frame rate, and a smaller, lighter body, and he's sold. Now, I find the smaller, lighter body a bit interesting. And my question to you, Alister, is if you could take the body of the FS5 and jam the FS7's internals, sensor, codecs, frame rates, all the rest of it into there, would you do it? Or would you keep them as two separate lines?
It's an interesting one. I would keep them as two separate lines. Now, the reasoning behind that is I see an awful lot of people that buy the FS5 and then spend the next 2 years trying to turn it into an FS7. And that, and we know that you can't change the image processing and stuff like that. So this isn't about the way the pictures look or the image processing, the arguments over 8-bit and 10-bit and everything else. This is purely about ergonomics and usability. And you'll find that people will buy an FS5 perhaps because they can't afford an FS7. The FS5 is a lot cheaper, and then they put all sorts of shoulder mounts and brackets and V-lock adapters and everything else. And what they end up with is something that's actually larger than an FS7 and heavier, because they want a shoulder mount camera. And essentially they bought the wrong camera. I understand it's not ever as simple as that, but I think there's definitely a place for the two. And the FS5, one of the issues that you run into is heat. Is that if you have a very small camera body, getting rid of the heat becomes harder. The FS7, it's a bit bigger. You can put a bigger fan. It's got a bigger fan in it. It's got a better cooling system and stuff like that. The FX9 is just that little bit bigger again, and a lot of that's to accommodate a bigger cooling system to get rid of the extra heat that's generated. So you've got lots of trade-offs and everything else. And I really like my FS5 because it is small, because it is compact, and I will often end up using the FS5 to get those shots that I can only get with an FS5 and just put up with the codec limitations because I know it's going to be good enough, and then go back to an FS7, FX9 size camera for everything else. So I think the two coexist very well, and I think it would be a mistake. We'll think about this. So would I put if I could shrink an FS7 down to an FS5 size? I suppose, yes, it would be nice to actually have an FS5 sized FS7. But then I'd probably also want an FS7 as well. Yeah,
so, which becomes strange, doesn't it?
Yeah, which is an odd one. I think, in the future, at some point the FS5 will get replaced. I know this isn't about the FS5 today. And obviously that will probably get an uptick in specs and things like that. So I'm sure that camera will get better. And I think it would be nice to also see the FS7 take a similar step forwards, with the new color science and things like that in it. So...
Levi is saying, Alister said there would be an upgrade, so now it has to happen, no take backs. That's not how it works, Levi. You know it's not. Cool. If you were able to have every single firmware update that you've dreamed about become real from Sony, that would be a pretty good situation to be in. Okay, Fenderman says, I didn't buy an FS5 with an external recorder because the total weight and power consumption would be higher than an FS7. What's the point?
Exactly, and that's the thing is that, I see that a lot. I really do. I think a lot of people, I see people asking, how do I get the best out of my FS5? Should I buy a Shogun and an Inferno and the RAW update and a shoulder bracket and a clamp and a rods and everything else? And you start pricing it up, and you think, well, actually, very often my advice to them is actually sell your FS5 and buy if you can't afford a new one, buy a used FS7. It's one of the great things about these solid state cameras. They don't generally wear out. I mean, obviously you'll get wear and tear, so you'll get scuff marks and scratches and stuff like that from use. And generally, the buttons and switches, yes, eventually they will wear out, but I don't hear of that many people where something's completely worn out on their cameras. Think about upgrading to an FS7 rather than bolting all that stuff on it, because it becomes a Franken rig that becomes really hard to use. So I think there's and this is why there is this place still for the FS7, because it is that little bit cheaper, it is that bit more affordable, but it still has the broadcast codecs, 10-bit recording. It has the lookup tables. It has all those really nice things that make it this well-rounded package.
Yeah, my normal advice for people when they come into the showroom and things like that, I'm trying to debate between the two cameras, is I say, look, in an ideal world, I mean, people would have both, because they do different jobs. One's a small camera for running around like this, one's a bigger camera for running around on your shoulder like that, But obviously, budget being what budgets are, you're going to have to pick which one suits you better. And when you're just talking about the ergonomics, just picture you on a normal shoot day and think, okay, how do I like as an operator to work? Do I like to be on a tripod and then like this, handheld, to sort of cradle shots a little bit? Or do I nearly always work from my shoulder and then I need to really quickly go between my shoulder and a tripod, shoulder, tripod, and not really much else? And I think deciding which one of those two modes fits your shooting style the best is going to be a big deciding factor between which one works better for you, the FS5 or the FS7.
I completely agree, yeah. But I also think that the reality, though, is that there is no one fits all. I know it's what we all want. We want that one camera that we could shoot absolutely everything just as easily, and that doesn't exist because the requirements are very, very different. If you want a small handheld camera that you can, as you say, cradle here and just run around with, the FS5 is brilliant. But the FS5 sucks on your shoulder. It really does. Whereas trying to run around with an FS7 here all day, it gets heavy very quickly. So there isn't a one-fits-all solution, because they are two very different ways of working. And this is why I think, and perhaps this is another strength in some regards of the FS7, is because it's that bit cheaper. You can buy an FS7, you can almost buy an FS7 and an FS5 for the price of an FX9. It's not that far off.
It's not that far off. I mean, I've got some of the website open here. So an FX9 body only is 9,300 exFAT at the moment. And an FS7 II is 6,000, so just under 7,000 exFAT. So yeah, that leaves you about $2,500 exFAT for difference there.
Yeah.
Which, you could nearly get an FS5 for that money. You could definitely get an A7 and things like that for that money, as a smaller camera. So that's definitely something to think about.
And I mean, these are the challenges of running a business. And I think this is the other thing, is that we're terrible as a lot of us cameramen. I'm appalling at this, is separating my camera, my business from my toys. My cameras are my toys, but they're also my business. And I think you've really got to be very careful and put your business head on when you're making these purchasing decisions, and say, well, actually, what's going to be better for my business? And there would be a very strong argument even now for an FS7 and an FS5 for all small businesses, because it gives you two cameras. It gives you that run and gun camera that you can go around and pick up all those really quick shots and things like that. And then you've got your FS7 for the shoulder mount and the more, let's call it serious stuff. But you've also then got two cameras, so you can have two camera shoots and things like that for the price of an FX9. Mm-hmm. Now, if I put my business head on from a moment, having two cameras from a business standpoint is a really good thing. It gives you a backup, if nothing else, if one breaks. Mm-hmm. So it gives you the ability to do more. Whereas the FX9, which is that bit more expensive, is one camera. Yeah, there's some image quality improvements, but you'll only realize those image quality improvements through shooting properly and everything else. And if you shoot properly with an FS7 and an FS5, they look great anyway.
Yep.
So I think from a business standpoint, if you've got 10 grand to spend, it's something you'd have to look at very carefully. Obviously, if you've got 13 grand to spend, you'd get an FX9 and an FS5. But, we don't all have unlimited budgets. And with the idea of buying these cameras isn't just to have them looking nice and to be able to say, oh, I've got the latest and greatest. It's to make money. So
Absolutely.
a lot of important decisions to be made.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to talk about before we wrap up. One is Tenderman's point. Was it Tenderman? No, Levi said here, what do you think the core reason for purchasing an FS7 over an FS5 is? Purely for broadcast codecs and ergonomics? I think for me it is. What do you think, Alister?
Yeah, I think that the core one for so many people is actually the broadcast codecs.
XAVCI.
Ergonomics perhaps come after that because, yes, you can build an FS5 up to be a shoulder camera, but the thing you can't do is get that 10-bit in all modes of operation, and also lookup tables. So if you are going to do a lot of shooting with log and things like that, the FS7 is much easier to use, I think, for log and things like that, because getting your exposure right is simpler, it's more straightforward. So ergonomics as well, those are the core things. I mean, other things that potentially there is, if you get the extension unit, you have time code in, time code out. You have 4 channels of audio, which is very nice. A lot of broadcast type productions need 4 channels. Two aren't enough very often. So there's lots of good reasons for that step up to the FS7. It is a lot more than just a slightly bigger camera than an FS5. There's a lot it does that the FS5 can't do.
There's a little bit of chat going on about used FS7 Mark 1s. Andrea says that they retail for extremely good prices these days. Sinbad has come back to say, I wouldn't buy an FS7 Mark 1 just because it doesn't have the variable ND. And he does have a big old point there. That variable ND, as we've said, is you said it was the best thing that Sony have brought to a camera. I completely agree. It changes the way that you work. When you start using it, it is very hard to go back to a camera that doesn't have it. The other thing I would be just a little bit cautious of with secondhand used FS7s, not that they're a bad purchase at all. We sell lots of secondhand FS7s. One thing I would be cautious of, though, is what are you buying? Are you buying a camera for one little job, or are you buying a workhorse camera that you want to last for a few years? Because a lot of secondhand FS7s have been around the block. These are cameras that are workhorses. They've been used a lot. And if you want one that is going to be used a lot like that for yourself, it might be better to buy a new one rather than a used one, I think would be my advice there. So
if you're in that second-hand market, so the FS7 Mark 1 was still being sold last year. So if you are on a very tight budget, I would avoid the very bargain basement cameras. I really would, unless you're looking for something that's basically a disposable, I'm going to use it for a year and chuck it away type camera. Which actually, if all you're going to spend is $2.5 grand, $3 grand, and I've seen some as low as that, then fill your boots, use it for a year and throw it away. That's not actually that bad in terms of an investment if you can make money out of it. But I would look for a young Mark 1. There's plenty of them out there. There's lots of choice. I would try and push for the Mark II if you can. It is that bit. The lens mount is much nicer. You'll have fewer issues with lens mounts becoming loose and things like that. But generally they are reliable cameras. But like everything, if it's been abused, if it hasn't been well looked after, these things, they can break, they do wear out. So do buy from a dealer if you can.
Absolutely. Because we sell a lot of secondhand gear. We buy in a lot of secondhand gear. And the FS7, especially now that the FX9 is out, lots of people have been making them jump over. And so we do have a lot of secondhand FS7 and FS7 Mark IIs going around at the moment. You buy from a dealer, you get somewhere to go back to if it goes wrong, you get a little bit of warranty, all the rest of it. There's a lot of reasons to buy from an established dealer there. So the last thing I wanted to talk about on it, I think, is probably lenses. Because when you start debating FS7 versus FX9, the sensor size is the main thing. And the main reason why that smaller Super 35 sensor, it feels weird to talk about Super 35 as a smaller sensor, doesn't it? But the reason that sensor size appeals is lenses. What lenses have you been using most with the FS7, do you reckon?
The lenses that I've been using most with the FS7 are the Fujinon MKs.
Right.
Those two lenses, for me, they were another part of this whole democratization of digital cinema. They really are proper digital cinema lenses. Yes, they're zooms, but they're more like variable length, focal length primes. The image that they produce looks like the image you get from a prime lens, and you can pick your focal length. And yeah, they're expensive in that if you consider how much an FS7 costs and how much the lenses cost, they're relatively expensive. If you buy the pair, they cost more.
I don't think that's a problem. My concern with the expense is really what can you use them on, because they're E-mount and they're E-mount manual. So really it's FS7 and FS5, that's mostly what you can use them on. So that's more of the limiting factor on whether they're worth spending the money on them. But they have brought out a whole range of third-party adapters, so you can put them on Micro Four Thirds, you can put them on RF mount from Canon, you can put them on all sorts of different things now. It's really just EF mount and I think PL mount you still can't, or maybe you can with PL mount.
No, you can't
remember.
No.
Yeah,
no,
if anyone wants to know more information on it, I did a stream with Fujinon a couple of weeks ago where we went through all of this, and I should remember it from that. But if you want to know more, go back and watch that stream with Mark. But of course, they will never be full frame. They are Super 35
No, but they're
lenses
going to work on
the
good news is you can use them on the FX9 5K scan mode.
Yes, that is very, very good news. So for those who don't know, what is the FX9's 5K scan mode?
Yeah, so the FX9's 5K scan mode is halfway between full frame and Super 35. And so it's not as big as full frame, but it's bigger than S35. And the 18 to 55 is usable from 21 millimeters in that mode, which is still pretty damn wide. And then the 50 to 135 pretty much works across the whole range. So that's really nice, and I'm really looking forward to using them on my FX9 once the firmware comes out.
Yeah, that's going to be added in is it October the firmware is coming?
Yeah, October is expected now. But other lenses, well, this was the whole thing about the FS7, wasn't it? An E-mount. I mean, this was one of the things that really excuse my language, so pissed off the F5 and F55 owners, was that when the FS7 came out, because it had E-mount, it was actually much more versatile and more flexible than the F5 and 55 with the FZ mount. So you could put far more lenses more easily on an FS7 than you could on an F5 and 55. And that was one of the frustrations actually for me with my F5 it's like, oh God, I wish it had an E-mount. Because there's virtually nothing that you can't put on those cameras. And the adapters are really cheap. And the whole full frame thing, I'm not saying that the full frame is bad in any way, shape or form, but if you use a speed booster on an FS7, you pretty much get exactly the same look as you would with full frame. There is no full frame magic. It's been much oversold. Full frame allows you to use a longer focal length to get a similar field of view, but there's nothing magical about the way it looks. There really, really isn't. So, putting a speed booster on an FS7 and using a full frame lens pretty much gives you the same thing. There's really not a great deal of difference. So don't feel that if you're buying an FS7 that, oh my God, it's second rate because it's only Super 35. Put the speed booster on there and actually it's not really that different. The benefit you get with an FX9 or something like with a full frame sensor is it's much easier to switch and pick and choose. You put a full frame lens on there and I can use full frame, I can use Super 35 and or even the 5K mode when that comes, and you have a lot, quickly, easily, and don't have to worry about adapters and things. And I can use native E-mount lenses. But if you have an FS7 and you've got Canon lenses, and you can use a speed booster to get a similar optical look to full frame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that has been a setup that people have been using for a long time now. A simple Metabone speed booster with full frame glass on it.
And it works.
It does work. It does limit you a little bit to stills lenses for the most part, though. That is potentially one of the problems. There's
it does,
very few...
and the autofocus is never as good going through an adapter as if you've got a native lens, I think.
Yep. Yeah, and that is actually something that we haven't talked about at all, is that the FX9 has that significantly better autofocus than the FS7. If they were going to add anything to the FS7, my pick would be the autofocus. It really does make a world of difference.
And that would require the new sensor, so that would probably require
absolutely. That's not going to be a simple firmware update that drops in for people. It's just not.
Yep. No, this because the sensor is what's doing all the work with the autofocus, because it has the dedicated phase detection sensors on the sensor. So, I mean, this comes out, this FS7 Mark III would probably have to have the FX9 sensor, but they might not use all of the area. They might just limit it to Super 35. I mean, it's just speculation, and I don't know. It's quite fun, I think, to think about if you were Sony, what would you do, and then see what does come up in a couple of years' time.
Absolutely,
and see how the thinking is.
But if you're a customer right now and you are looking for a Super 35 camera, because that's the lenses that you have, you want broadcast quality codecs, you want a little bit of slow motion, and decent ergonomics, all the rest of it. I mean, it's hard to recommend something really that isn't the FS7 in that sort of environment, isn't it? I mean, there are a few options now. There's the EVA 1, there's the C300 and all the rest of it. But the FS7 still is incredible value for money. It fits into pretty much any style of production and is widely used and accepted in any style of production. It is a very sensible camera, I think, is a nice way to sum it up.
Again, putting my business hat on instead of my toys hat on, is that if you are a jobbing cameraman, freelance cameraman, and you want to get as much work as you possibly can, then the FS7 is the camera to own. Not the FX9. And this isn't a budget thing. This isn't whether you can afford an FS7 or you can afford an FX9 in terms of actually the camera that's asked for. It's the FS7. And if you have an FS7 and somebody rings you up and say, have you got an can you come and do this shoot? You can just say yes. If you've got FX9, you've got to then go, well, actually, I don't have an FS7. I've got an FX9. And if they don't know what the FX9 is or they've never used one, you've then got to try and convince them that that's going to be okay. And then they might say, well, actually, no, everything else we've shot's been FS7, so it's not going to match. And they'd have a point. So from a business point of view, and given that the FS7 is still going to be around for at least a couple of years, you know, if you should be able to make money on the purchase of an FS7 if you bought one today. There is no reason why not, if you are a working cameraman, that you should not be able to recover that money. It's not a great deal of money in the grand scheme of things these days.
Yeah, it's a very solid business expense. Right, okay, so I think that sums that up very nicely. Thank you so much for your time, Alister, as always. And thank you so much to everyone who's watching. Some great comments once again. I think we will definitely be back with more with you, Alister. Absolutely. I don't think we've got anything in the diary yet, have we? But we will do.
No.
Nope.
So let us know what you'd like. That's the thing, guys. We're struggling. Yeah, we go away and we sit down.
We're out of ideas now.
And we could come up with something and everyone's going like, what the hell are they talking? I'm not interested in that. So let us know what you want us to talk about. What is it that you want to know about? And then we can do that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. But we will be back with more streams very, very soon. So thank you, Alister, for joining me. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. And I will see you all very soon.
XS Wireless Digital is the perfect wireless audio solution for content creators and filmmakers. Thanks to a 2.4 GHz transmission, XS Wireless Digital is a truly plug-and-play system that allows you to upgrade your in-camera audio with one-button operation. With a variety of configurations to choose from, This entry point into the world of wireless will improve your workflow and will expand the possibilities of how you capture audio for your video. For more information, visit sennheiser.com/xswd. The MKE600 is a shotgun microphone ideal for professional video camera applications. Maximal rejection of ambient side noises thanks to pronounced directivity. And because the MKE600 has a very good suppression of structure-borne noise, it makes one of the most versatile all-round shotgun microphones on the market.
The new Super 35 sensor that Canon have introduced with the C300 Mark III is quite a big step up from other S35 sensors that they have created before. From the body and the flexibility that gives us in terms of the expansion packs and the interchangeable mount, to the sensor with its increased dynamic range for tackling scenes that possibly we couldn't have tackled or captured faithfully before, I can get more out of this camera. My money goes further. It's as simple as that from a business standpoint. from a creative point of view, it's unquestionably unlocking more creative avenues for us as filmmakers.